This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking for the second time to Giancarlo Fiorella. He's going to tell us about the chaos currently going on in Venezuela and hopefully give us a nuanced look of what's happening on the ground rather than people screaming their politics on Twitter, which seems to be going on quite a lot at the minute when it comes to the coverage. Now, many people have been out on the streets saying they want Maduro to go. There have been clashes, paramilitaries have killed people, and there is also a lot of talk that the US is meddling, trying to orchestrate a coup, because there's now this opposition leader saying he is the rightful president, and there are dozens of countries backing him. The whole situation is very fragile. There have been troops sent to the border. Maduro has said he's going to protect the whole country, every single corner militarily, so it's not looking good right now for Venezuela. So yeah, Giancarlo is going to be explaining all of this for us. He's been covering the area meticulously for a very long time now. He's doing a PhD in criminology at the University of Toronto and is currently an investigator and trainer for Latin America for Bellingcat, which will allow idiots to call him some kind of CIA agent or something, but you know, idiots are idiots. To support Popular Front, please go to patreon.com/popularfront. Every little bit helps. Even if you just want to sign up for the $1, it's going to make a big difference in the long run. So I don't even know where to begin with this Venezuela situation, to be honest. I think maybe if you just explain to us why on the 23rd did everybody come out into the streets again? Because there were protests throughout 2017. I believe there have been on and off protests since 2014. But then, you know, everything kind of went quiet for a while. And now we're seeing some very big movement in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, so the protest for the 23rd had been planned a couple of weeks in advance. It had been announced by the opposition. January 23rd is an important date in Venezuelan history because it's when we kicked out a dictator that we had back in 1958. So this year we have a new National Assembly. Every year there's a new National Assembly president, right? So this year they selected Juan Guaido. So there was a lot of expectation about what he might do, how he might want to tackle the Maduro regime. And so that coincided with Maduro's taking of him being sworn in to be president for the next term, because you might remember that there was a presidential election last year that Maduro stole. So starting in early January, Maduro is sworn in. He's the president until 2025. Everyone's really upset. And the opposition says, let's have this big protest on the 23rd. So we can, sort of maybe get organized again and see if we can do something about Maduro. And I personally was really surprised by what happened that day. I don't know other sort of political commentators or people who watch this more closely, but I was totally blown away when Guaido declared himself interim president.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit then. When you say Maduro stole the election in 2018, what do you mean he stole it? What did he do?
In Venezuela, the institution that organizes and holds elections is completely under the control of the government. It's called, in Spanish, it's called the CNE. And for years and years now, they've done they've pulled every trick in the book to make sure that the government wins all the votes, right? Most strikingly, I think, is what they did for the Constituent Assembly vote. The Constituent Assembly vote, which was in 2017. And that's when, I think really for the first time in all of the years that we've had the CNE operating in this way, they just straight up made up the results of the election. I think I might have mentioned it when we last spoke. The company that provides the voting machines to Venezuelan elections came out after that vote, and they said the results that were announced by the CNE are not the ones that we recorded in our machines. So, no question asked, the CNE just made up the result of the election. So starting at that point, people really lose whatever little hope they had left on the CNE. So leading up to the May 20 election, the CNE outlawed some opposition parties. They had been individually outlawing certain people from running. So there was a bunch of opposition candidates who, including probably who was the front runner at the time. His name was Enrique Capriles, who were just banned from running for office. So the CNE was both selectively banning people from running for office as well as entire political parties. So come May 20, people are really, people are, I think, recognizing that this election has been set up to be won by Maduro, before the first ballot was even cast.
Right, so it's a complete mockery of so-called democracy. It's not like, oh, well, this guy has been put in by the Americans or whatever. Like, this was before that, right? This was basically, this guy won by popular vote and Maduro just rigged it. Is that what you're saying?
The May 20 election was rigged, yeah. And you referring to Guaido now? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was elected in the 2015 parliamentary election. So he was chosen for one of the states in Venezuela as basically like a senator, I guess, in the United States, to serve on the national legislature. So he's been around since 2015. And one of the things that the government did was when it lost the National Assembly in that election, the National Assembly went from being controlled by the PSUV, the ruling party, to being controlled by the opposition. The Supreme Court, which is also made up entirely of Maduro loyalists, began striking down everything that the National Assembly did. So for years, the National Assembly has really been dead in the water. They'll try to pass laws, or they'll try to do anything, and the Supreme Court and the government will say, well, we're just going to ignore what you're doing. But at least, Guaido has that claim to legitimacy. The government didn't dispute the results of the 2015 election. He won, as far as we can tell, totally fair and square. And it just so happens that this year he was elected by the assembly to be the president of the entire legislature.
Right. So let's get this straight. So the election was rigged. And he has been basically put in charge of representing the opposition now that things are starting to move again. Is that right?
Yeah. Every year the National Assembly elects a new president. So it just so happens that this year it's him. I've seen some commentators from outside of Venezuela who are like, whoa, like, who is this Guaido guy? We've never heard of him. Like, he must be some like suit put in by the CIA or like some like robot that got activated by John Bolton overnight to take over the country for the United States. But he's been around forever. He was one of the leaders of a really influential student movement in 2007. He was one of the founding members of the Voluntad Popular Party in 2009. And like I said, he's been representing his state since 2015. He's been around he's been in politics for a while.
Well, yeah, this is the problem when you have these, usually white Western communists telling Venezuelans what to feel and, what's going on. But we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's talk about January 23rd. So now we got that out of the way. What happened on January 23rd? You said that you were shocked. Why was that?
Right. So on the 23rd, Guaido was speaking to a crowd in Caracas, and he declared himself interim president. So that was a really big move. People had been expecting him to do something like that, or I think they were wanting him to do something like that starting in early January, because in early January is when the National Assembly began to meet for this year. So, dates and timing is important. The National Assembly begins to meet in January. They're supposed to swear in Maduro as president on the 10th, I believe. A couple of days before, the National Assembly says, we're not going to swear in Maduro. He's not the president. He stole the election. We're not going to validate his stealing the election by swearing him in. So Maduro says, well, I don't need the National Assembly. I'll just get sworn in by my friends in the Supreme Court. So Maduro gets sworn into the Supreme Court, I think, on the 10th. And then everybody looks to the opposition because now the ball's in their court. And one of the things that they could have done was invoke one of the articles of the Constitution. It's Article 233 that says, if the presidency is vacant, and it lists a bunch of reasons why the presidency might be vacant, like if the president is sick, or if he abandons the country, or if he steals an election and declares himself, basically like a dictator, then the National Assembly can, call that out. And the president of the National Assembly becomes interim president. And that's exactly what he did on January 23rd. He stood in front of the crowd, he raised his right hand in the air, and he said, I swear, I take this oath, whatever, that I am declaring myself, invoking Article 233, declaring myself interim president of Venezuela pending elections. So like I said, I was really surprised. I think a lot of people were. And that's why we've got this, we've got two presidents now, essentially. We have a constitutional crisis unfolding right now.
So after this Guaido guy has said, right, I'm going to run this kind of opposition against Maduro, people are in the streets. There's been protests. I read earlier, I think, over 30 people have been shot and killed. What's going on in the streets?
So Guaido he gave a speech last night, a really quick, he was on Periscope, and he announced the next, we'll call them street actions, the next protests. And I think a lot of people were expecting him to call for daily protests, which is what we saw in 2014 and 2017. So you might remember back then we had a couple of months of really, daily protests all around the country.
For a while, it was looking like a small insurgency, to be honest, or at least the start of one.
Exactly, yeah. So interestingly, last night he said, look, the next protest is going to be on Wednesday, he said, and then we're going to have another one on Saturday. So, and he said the reason why that is because I understand that we got to look for food, and we can't, people can't afford really to be on the streets every single day, given the severity of the crisis in Venezuela. And I remember that's an argument that came up quite a bit. Certainly during the 2017 protest movement, where people were saying like we can't physically be on the streets all the time. Like I have to go line up at supermarkets to in the hopes of finding food. So it seems like Guaido this time is trying to switch it up a bit. He's not calling for the same kinds of daily protests, but they're still planning events. And so the first one is going to be on Wednesday. He said from 12 to 2. So it's a very organized protest from noon to 2 p.m. And then there's going to be a really big one, he said, on Saturday, and that might be like a day-long affair. But those are just the ones that are announced. The other thing to remember is that there's, spontaneous protests in Venezuela all the time. It's not uncommon for, residents of a particular area of a city or a town to, block a road because they haven't had electricity for a while or they haven't had water in a while. And those don't typically make it to, certainly in the international media. Those are still going on all over the country, but the big ones, the ones that grab headlines across the world, those are occurring less frequently, at least up to this point.
Right, but people have already died. I know that you were saying that he's calling for protests, but people have already died. I think on the 23rd, someone died immediately, like someone was shot. Who's doing this?
Yeah, so people have been killed because the situation is so fluid right now. I'm seeing ranges of estimates of fatalities. The most recent numbers that I saw were 42 killed in the last week. I think that's a more accurate number. I think this is all preliminary information, is probably closer to 35. That's what I'm more comfortable sort of reporting. But the range is probably about 35 to 42. The first fatalities, they occurred before the 23rd, which also took a lot of people by surprise because it seemed like there was so much tension in the country in anticipation for January 23rd that we saw protests even on the 21st and the 22nd. Like it's almost like people couldn't wait to go protest, right? So different from previous protest waves, it looks like the bulk of the repression and at least the bulk of the killing is being done by a police body. It's part of the National Bolivarian Police, and it's called, in Spanish, it's FAES. It's FAES. They're the same guys that actually killed Oscar Perez and his fighters in El Junquito last year.
So the paramilitaries, basically.
Yes.
I know that being police and maybe paramilitary is quite a fine line there in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, they're the kind of guys you see with like full face coverings, like all these crazy weapons. They also did they played a big role in a thing, in like a security initiative, and I'm doing air quotes right now. I realize people can't see them, but it was a security initiative a couple of years ago. It's called the OLP, and it was supposed to be like a security initiative. But basically what we saw were death squads that were made up of largely of these FAES guys who would just drive into barrios and they would, just sort of murder people at will. And so they've been around for a while in Venezuela. People know them as basically death squads. They're doing most of the repression, it seems like, this year. And in previous years, that hasn't been the case. In previous years, the repression has been mostly carried out by the National Guard. So people are reading a lot into that. Some people are saying, well, it's because the army is starting to crack, or Maduro doesn't feel confident calling on the National Guard. to do the job this year, and he's going to like these FIS guys who are really sort of hardcore and are willing to sort of do these things more often. So I don't know. It's too early to tell, but that is an observation that we can make, that the FIS is much more involved in the repression this year than they have in previous years.
Right. You just mentioned about the military is starting to correct. Tell us about that. I have seen a few videos now where I think, a general maybe, or I might have got that wrong, but, high up members of the military have, I think, sworn allegiance to the opposition, right? And there was also this video of, I don't know who they look like, military guys, but I don't know, maybe just rebels in Colombia saying we're going to go to the border, basically noise up Maduro. I mean, nothing has happened yet with that as far as I know, but I guess what's going on, this is unprecedented, right? We didn't really see this other than Oscar Perez when the protests were happening in 2017.
Yeah, this is unprecedented. So there's a couple of things going on there. Prior to the 2030, we did see those videos from Peru and Colombia of men in Venezuela army uniforms declaring themselves an open rebellion against the government. So there was a lot of discussion about who those men might be. I suspect that they're deserters. I mean, something like, well over 1 million people have left the country in recent years, and it's perfectly reasonable to say that some of them might have been soldiers and that they might have brought their uniforms with them. So we saw the video from Peru, we saw it from Colombia, and I don't know where those guys are. They did say that they were marching towards the border. We haven't heard from them since. We also had, I think that we had the military attaché at the embassy in Washington. So the guy from the Ministry of Defense, he defected in a video, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, but we haven't seen anything like really like the army cracking. On the 22nd, we did have a National Guard outpost in Caracas rebel. All those guys were arrested in a couple hours, and I think they're all in prison right now. One of the other things that makes this protest wave unprecedented and different from the other ones is that the opposition has passed an amnesty law. They passed it on the 15th, and they're really driving the point home through their protest actions that this law is on the table for anybody, any regime official, including soldiers, who want to contribute to restoring democracy in the country. So what they're hoping to do is to convince soldiers or generals or anybody in the military to switch sides, and that's something that hasn't really happened in previous years beyond just making the general appeal. The opposition has gone the sort of all the way with this and said, we're not just calling on you to join us. Like we've passed a law specifically to allow you to join us.
Like a quick transition.
Yeah, just like, if you want to switch sides, now is the time to do it. We've got this interim president who's getting recognized by countries around the world. And also like there's this law that will protect you. So you can rest assured that we're not going to throw you in jail or, et cetera, right? So that's new to this year. It hasn't been working, I think, because like I said, we haven't really seen any movement from the military. I mean, we've seen movement sort of in the other way. The Minister of Defense issued a statement, I think, after the 24th. He released a video saying, we're with Maduro, he's our leader, et cetera, right? So if there is discontent in the army, and I'm sure there is, we're just not seeing it right now.
Okay, and I saw this really weird video the other day. I think it was on Maduro's Twitter, and he's riding around. It's so strange. It's really badly shot, and he's got some like weird. He looks like Kim Jong-il, like or Kim Jong-un, and he's in this boat. I think he's around Curacao, and he's saying like, "Oh, we're prepared to defend the borders." Yeah,
that's the one. There was a series of videos. In one of the videos, he's like trying to jog with the soldiers, and it looks really awkward. Yeah, I saw that one. He's in that boat with his army friends. He was in Puerto Cabello, which is, it's on the coast of Venezuela, I guess, facing up towards Curacao. Those sorts of events are relatively common in Venezuela, but this one, because it's happening in this context of this constitutional crisis, takes on a special meaning. And I think it was very clearly meant to show Maduro was still in charge of the army, that he commanded the respect of the soldiers. There's a video of him like giving him a speech. I know the soldiers are sitting down in front of him and they're kind of like looking up at him, with admiration. That's all clearly staged to provide that image that Maduro is squarely in charge of the army. Nobody's rebelling. Everything's fine. And that's clearly the message in those videos.
Well, yeah, it's authoritarian government 101, isn't it? You know, you always see when the cracks start to show, authoritarian governments will basically put on a show for everyone else.
Yeah, what people have been pointing out is like, you know, the same day that he did that, I think that was, I mean, everything's moving so fast. I think that was yesterday, probably. You know, you have like images of opposition leaders surrounded by crowds of civilian supporters, and then you have, you know, juxtaposed with that, Maduro surrounded by, you know, hundreds of soldiers and tanks and guns. You know, it's some interesting imagery going on there for sure.
Yeah, I think we should talk about the US meddling as well. Now, I know that a lot of people online who have done absolutely no reading on this are immediately screaming, US coup, you know, keep Maduro in. And then there are others who are suggesting that the US is nothing to do with this, which I think would be incredibly naive to think they don't have a very big hand, you know, in the pie right now. But what it, you know, it's not a coup. Is it a revolution? What's happening? Maybe you can give us a clear, nuanced version right now.
In previous occasions, in previous protest waves, I've tried not to sort of read too much into those sort of commentaries. I mean, I think it's clear that people are, and by people I'm saying here, people who don't live in Venezuela, they're looking at the situation through their domestic political lenses. So if you live in England, you look at it through whatever's happening in England, right? Like if you live in the US, you look at it through the Trump, sort of lens, right? And that distorts the picture, because in Venezuela, people don't care about the politics in England or the politics in the United States too much, right?
And they certainly don't care about the politics in your stupid fucking class at university.
Yeah, right. Like there's more immediate concerns to the Venezuela. Like the reason why they're protesting is not because of whatever you might be learning in class. It's because, you know, there's these conditions. The conditions in Venezuela are such that they're breeding these protests, right? Corruption, lack of medicine and food, etc. So those sort of commentaries I always kind of try to ignore, because they're just, for the most part, they're really ill-informed, right? And I think the one that I did see, so, you know, what would be sort of a good stance to take on this? Definitely any kind of intervention, foreign intervention in this is completely undesirable. Like that's the worst thing that could happen. You know, and that goes for the United States, it goes for Russia, it goes for any power that thinks, you know, we can sort of manipulate what's going on in the country and dictate the fate of the country. That it cannot happen.
I think that too, but maybe you can explain why.
Well, because, you know, any kind of meddling I think in this case, I think I might have mentioned this in the previous podcast, but like if the country is going to move beyond this tragic period, we're talking about, you know, almost 20 years now of this political program that really hasn't worked, it has to come to an end, and it has to be pushed aside by the people of Venezuela. If the United States comes and they, you know, install a puppet government or whatever, that's not going to help. It might, you know, like bring food back to the supermarkets, maybe, I don't know, but that's not good for the country. It won't help. And I'm talking here about the U.S. and I'm talking also about Russia. I mean, I think it's also important to consider the fact that, you know, if you're talking about meddling in Venezuela, like you can't just look at the U.S. Yes, the U.S. has a history of intervention in Latin America, but you know, we saw the report from Reuters just a couple days ago saying that there might be as many as 400 mercenaries from Wagner in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, and just for anyone that doesn't know, Wagner is this allegedly Kremlin-linked paramilitary group that Russia can kind of send in here, there, and everywhere. They've been seen in the Donbass, in Ukraine. They're all over Syria. Now we're hearing that they were, what was it, protecting Maduro? Is that right?
Yeah, that's what the Reuters report said. So the estimates, again, this is all based on this one report that I read, was that it's either small groups of these mercenaries or up to 400, I think is what's cited in the piece. And supposedly they're there to protect Maduro. So this is an issue that involves the Venezuelan people. It's the Venezuelan people who are protesting on the streets. It's Venezuelan people who are dying at the hands of the government, you know, fighting for a better country. So it has to be resolved by them. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, like, okay, what's an appropriate response? What do I think is an appropriate response from an international observer who is concerned about the situation in Venezuela and who wants to help? I think Bernie Sanders had a really good response.
Yeah, I do as well, actually. I saw that and I was like, that is a good take. You know, it doesn't mean deny the history of US doing horrible, horrific things whilst meddling in other countries. But that doesn't mean that you also then go, yeah, let's side with this monstrous person who is allowing people to starve to death.
Yeah, it was perfect. He led with, I think it was like 2 or 3 tweets. He said, Maduro has violently repressed the protests. The presidential elections were rigged. The countries in the economic situation is horrendous. But and that's important, but, we can't forget what the U.S. has done, and we can't allow it to happen again. And so I don't know why a lot of people can't seem to make that their position. You can say, and, I don't want Maduro in power. The Venezuelan people don't want Maduro in power. He has to go. The Venezuelan people should be allowed to choose their next president. And also at the same time, I don't want the United States or Russia or anybody else to interfere. That's not an incoherent position. You can have those two thoughts in your head at the same time, right? Like,
well, yeah, you would think.
Yeah, but I don't see why some people are, like you said, like they're saying, well, I'm anti-U.S., therefore I'm pro-Maduro. That's not, try the other way. Try to say Maduro's bad, he should go. There shouldn't be any more protests or deaths. People should be able to choose their own president. And also at the same time, I don't want the U.S. to do anything in Venezuela.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what you were saying earlier. First of all, people are ignorant to the actual facts, but really they're looking at it through, I think, a prism of which team am I on, and it's like, it's absolutely not that simple. It really isn't that simple. Unfortunately, I think things are so toxic now that that's how it gets looked at. That being said, I want to ask you, I've seen a lot of people claiming that the opposition are fascists, they're far right. In fact, there was a politician in the White House, and she was saying, she actually called the opposition far right. I think the context was slightly different to that, but it was alluding to that. What do you think of that?
No. So to say that the opposition is far right, first of all, the opposition is everybody who doesn't like Maduro, and we're talking about millions of people. So to say that they're all, that they're fascists, or that a majority of them are fascists, is just incorrect. I think that, I've seen tweets of some opposition leaders, including Guaido, like congratulating, for example, Bolsonaro on his win, right? And there's no doubt that they see Trump as an ally, just because Trump is an enemy of Maduro, right? So I think that just as international observers look at Venezuelan politics through their own lenses, politicians in Venezuela look at international politics through their own lenses. And so they also have distorted views of what's going on in Brazil and what's going on in the United States. So a lot of, some people in Venezuela might say, oh, like Bolsonaro's a good guy. And if you ask them, why would you say that? They'll say, well, because the only thing I know about him is that he doesn't like Maduro.
Right, yeah. So they know as little about him as the people that are saying they're all fascists, basically.
Right. So it's exactly the same thing. We look at things that happen in countries that we, don't, we're not from there. We don't understand the political history, but we look at them at events there through our own political lenses. And the same thing happens in Venezuela. So that's one argument that I've heard people say, like, oh, like Guaido is clearly a fascist because he tweeted, congratulations to Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is a horrible person. And, personally, I wouldn't have, I wish he hadn't done that. He congratulated him, but I think he's just doing it. He did it just because of that same reason. He's looking at the situation in Brazil through the Venezuelan political lens, and he's saying, who's going to help us? Who's anti-Maduro? Anybody who's anti-Maduro is my friend, right? That's problematic on for a number of reasons. The other example that I hear is that people will like pick out individual instances of protester violence, and they'll say, like all the protesters are like literally like guerrillas who are like, violent fascists who are going around killing cops. So, you have a situation of generalized violence throughout the country. The government's repressing peaceful protests everywhere. And you're going to have instances of protesters doing violent things. But you can't then take those individual examples and paint the entire opposition movement, by these handful of examples of protester violence. There's a really long history of people siding with oppressors in protest movements, right? Like anytime you look at a protest movement in history, there's people who were defending the authorities who were doing all the repression. I saw recently a Gallup poll taken after the Kent State shooting, when the National Guard shot all the student protesters back during the Vietnam War unrest in the United States. And like most people supported the National Guard. and almost nobody, it was like 11% supported the students, right? So that always happens. People are always going to pick out individual examples of protester violence, and they're going to say the entire protest movement is full of violent people who just want to kill, the opposite side. Those are the two strategies that I've seen people deploy, linking or pointing to any sort of links between like Guaido and Trump or Guaido and Bolsonaro. And saying, well, they're all the same kind of horrible fascist types, and then pointing to individual instances of protester violence and saying all of the protesters are violent when that's not the case.
But even if they are violent, so what? You need to use violence to fight against authoritarianism. It just absolutely, history has shown us that has to be true. You can't passively just ignore it. I'll tell you what I find very strange is when these kind of all cops are bastards, leftist types suddenly become pro-state when what they see as their side is being attacked. It's almost like, what, you know what I mean? Does the theory mean nothing to you anymore? I don't know. It fascinates me. I think it's, a good case study on all that stuff. But what about this situation anyway, where all these countries are starting to recognize the opposition, and they're saying like, what, he's got 8 days, Maduro's got 8 days to hold an election or something like that. What are they going to do?
Yeah, so that was one of the other things that people pointing to and to say, oh, this is clearly like a U.S. conspiracy to install this guy in government, because as soon as he declared himself president on the 23rd, I think the U.S. was the first country to recognize him within like an hour. It was really quickly. And then it was Canada and the countries of the Lima Group, which is this regional bloc of countries that formed in 2017 to help the opposition and to sort of organize international response against the Maduro regime. So we've had the United States recognize Guaido. We've had Canada. Last I checked, it was well over a dozen countries, and I think a lot of the EU ones did as well. So, all of that is evidence, I think, of the fact that, like, before declaring himself president, Guaido called him up and said, hey, like, just a heads up, if I were to declare myself president tomorrow, would you support me, right?
It's a smart move, actually, politically.
Yeah, like, I would want my political leaders to also plan more than, like, a couple of minutes ahead, right? So I think that's what happened there. I don't think people should be surprised or take that as evidence of some, vast conspiracy. The EU ultimatum that you're referring to, that was issued, I think it was on Saturday or maybe even Friday. And it was a statement from the EU saying to Maduro, so it didn't recognize Guaido as president. Just to backtrack a bit, at least I don't think it did. I'm going off memory here. I think what the statement said was, Maduro, you have to call free, transparent elections within the next 8 days, or we will recognize Guaido as president. So they gave him a deadline. And I mentioned earlier that we have a big a protest planned for Saturday. And that protest, Guaido explained, was to show support for the ultimatum, which is expiring on Sunday. So starting on Sunday, if Maduro hasn't called elections, I don't think he will. According to that EU statement, they would recognize Guaido as president, which has all kinds of implications for how the country accesses finances, how it conducts diplomacy, and we're already starting to see some of that unfold.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, it seems very unlikely that Maduro is going to hold an election just because the EU told him to.
Yeah, so I think that's probably the least likely scenario. I think what the opposition is going for this time is a negotiated exit for Maduro and his people. I think the amnesty law plays a big role in that. Guaido has been pressed a couple of times in different interviews if he would even include Maduro in that amnesty law. So like if Maduro were to say, okay, I'm leaving, don't come looking for me. And he sort of oscillated. He as from what I can tell, he hasn't said yes or no either way, but he's sort of hinted at yes.
With the fact he hasn't said no hints at yes as well, I think.
Yeah, right. He hasn't said no. It's everybody but him. He said things like, well, everybody's included. If any official wants to come talk to me, I'll be waiting. He did name Diosdado Cabello and Freddy Bernal, who are these two big PSUV guys. He called them out by name, and he said, if you two want to come talk to me, I'm here, right? So I wouldn't discount, that's the best solution, I think, a negotiated exit. So Maduro and all of the, it's a long list of people, but Maduro and all of his guys and girls, they leave the country. There's a new electoral authority appointed, and we have free and fair elections, and people can actually vote for who they want to be president. I don't know if that's likely. I think that's what the opposition is playing for. I think that's the best situation. The other possibility is it's becoming less likely, and I can explain why in a minute. But when Guaido first declared himself president, I thought that the government would try to do what they've always done with the opposition, which is just ignore them. So I mentioned earlier that the opposition won the National Assembly in 2015, and then all of the laws that they passed, the government just ignored. They got the Supreme Court to say, no, this isn't really a law, we're not going to follow it. And so I thought that, maybe if he didn't gain a lot of force, through being recognized by other countries, the government would just sort of ignore him. And they would say, okay, anybody can declare themselves president of anywhere. So, good luck with that, right? Like, you go and be president and we'll do our thing. I think that's becoming less likely because of the international recognition. So there was a report earlier that the Bank of England was refusing to hand over something like $1.2 billion worth of gold that they had stashed for Maduro. And I think, I saw a report also that the United States had recognized an appointed person by Guaido as like the legitimate ambassador to the U.S., not the one that Maduro had appointed. So I think if we start to see more countries sort of like refusing to deal with Maduro diplomatically or financially, the government won't be able to ignore that. So they're not going to just be able to do what they've done before, because it's really going to hurt them. Like they won't be able to conduct any kind of foreign policy, and they won't be able to access money or. So because we're starting to see hints that that's happening, I think the government ignoring this is going to be less likely a possibility than I thought initially.
You just said then that the Bank of England are holding money basically from Maduro, and I know that the US is also holding money from them. Surely that is affecting the food situation. Like, I know the reason that everybody is starving and there isn't food is because of horrific mismanagement by Maduro, but the Americans and the Brits holding money from that country, surely that is going to have a horrible effect on the people there. I mean, I get it, we don't want to let Maduro have the money, but shouldn't they do that, like, to stop people starving?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know. Yes, like, we don't want people to suffer. Like, let's be absolutely clear. Yeah, we shouldn't do anything that will make the people of Venezuela suffer more. I think probably what the opposition and, the Bank of England and people who are withholding money from the government are thinking is that, like, well, these guys are just going to steal that money. Anyways, like, this isn't really going for food and medicine, right? I mean, that's true to a certain extent. Like, some of that money was stolen, but the scarcity crisis, as severe as it was, obviously there was still some food in the supermarkets and there was still some medicine, right? It was still a horrendous situation, which was caused directly by this unchecked government corruption. But that's precisely what I'm saying. That makes the situation much more volatile for the government. They can't ignore if those sorts of things continue to happen, they won't be able to just ignore Guaido and hope that he goes away. They're going to have to do something. But I have no idea what that something is.
Well, with that in mind, then, do you think that Venezuela could be headed towards a war?
I was really afraid of that in the first maybe 24, 48 hours after the 23rd, because I thought if anybody's on the fence, any general, any whatever sergeant, anybody in the army thinking about switching sides, this is going to be the moment they're going to do it. And they haven't done it yet. So the first 24 hours, I was really nervous. I was sort of expecting it to happen. The 48 hours, I thought, well, maybe still. Now we're heading into the first week of this, and we haven't seen the army turn. I could think of a situation where there is something like a civil war. If this continues, if we continue to have this presidential crisis where we have two presidents, and suddenly the government, the Maduro government, doesn't have access to finance. I could see the situation becoming so unstable, so untenable in the country that pushes even the soldiers who haven't turned against the government so far, that might push them over the edge, right? So it's a really unprecedented time in Venezuelan history. It's really hard to predict. But I don't want to say that that's a very high possibility that would happen. I still like to think that the negotiated exit is the most likely thing that would happen. It would certainly, I think, be the best thing.
Yeah, I mean, it would, but I don't know. I mean, as an outsider, it doesn't look good, especially the fact you have to remember, like we said earlier, up to 35 people have been killed in less than a week since this happened. I don't know, that to me seems mad. It seems like a very bad precedent.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing to consider when thinking about, what is there going to be a civil war? Like, who would switch? Which units would switch? I think it's important to keep in mind that in one of the reasons why the Maduro regime has lasted so long is because it does count on the support of the upper and I would say even the mid-level army guys, but there's clearly discontent at the lower levels. So in the mutiny that we saw in Caracas last week, there was a really remarkable video of the negotiations that happened between the National Guard commander that the government sent to this base to negotiate with these soldiers who were staging this mutiny. And one of the soldiers has a really sort of frank conversation with the commander, and he tells him things like, look, we're rebelling because we don't have, like, I haven't been paid in weeks, and whatever I am paid I can't buy any food. The guy tells him, the soldier tells the commander that he's homeless, that he's got kids, he's got to worry about how he's going to be. So, when we say like the army is corrupt and they're we're talking about the high level guys, right? So like the average soldier, like the normal soldier in Venezuela is suffering as well. So, again, thinking about what would a fracturing of the military look like, it would have to, I think, happen starting at the very low levels. But then again, there's a question of effectiveness, right? Like if you have a couple of soldiers breaking off here and a couple of soldiers breaking off there in small groups, I think the government can pretty safely deal with that sort of stuff. That's kind of what they've been doing really since Maduro came to power. But it's just another factor to consider.
And what about militant attacks? What about some kind of rebel group, perhaps not even linked to the military, starting to attack?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we've had the history. Like Oscar Perez was probably the most famous one of those guys. I think the conditions are there for anybody who wants to, like, it's been known that soldiers will sell their equipment for money, obviously, right? So like they'll sell their rifles or they'll sell grenades. There was like a string of grenade attacks that I think were just tied to sort of like ordinary crime a couple years ago, and people were like, "Where are all these grenades coming from? Like, how are people getting their hands on grenades?" And it's like they're falling out of trucks basically at the army, right? People are selling them. So I think the conditions are there for anybody who wants to like set up some kind of like rebel group to like pretty easily access guns. I think. At least military grade ones. But the fact that we haven't seen anything like that happen yet, I think is telling, right? Yeah. Like 35 people have been killed. That's a tragedy. But when you look at the videos of the protests and you see how many people were out protesting, it's almost like miraculous that more people haven't been killed. Again, I don't want to minimize the tragedy, the fatalities. Any death is tragic, but you can sort of look at it the other way and say like, wow, even in this level of chaos and like really we have two presidents. Like, what does that mean? There's still somehow, not all out sort of warfare on the streets as you might expect, right?
And what about Colombia? I saw that footage this morning of what looked like, I think it was heavy weapons, I think howitzers and stuff like that. They were being sent to the border, or at least in the direction of the Colombian border. Why would they need to do that?
So I'm aware of that video. I haven't verified if it shows really what it claims to show, that these are moving towards Colombia. Colombia has historically been the scapegoat for the Maduro regime. Everything that goes wrong in the country, they tie back to Colombia. I think, they don't, when Maduro says like, oh, the reason there's no electricity is because of Colombia, he doesn't believe that, obviously. I don't think he does. But I think now they're probably they see Colombia as more of a threat than they would normally. And just because I'm sure they're thinking about, okay, like if there were to be some kind of invasion, like where would it come from? Well, Colombia is pretty close with the U.S., right? We have a really big border. So I think if there are troop movements towards Colombia, again, I haven't verified this myself. It's probably just like in anticipation for maybe not something that's going to happen, but a possibility, right? I haven't seen any other videos of troop movements, so I'll be interested in seeing if there's any more. Anything to do with the military right now, everybody's watching really closely because
Very fragile situation. And what happened with the currency today? I saw they were saying that the official currency is now at the same level as the black market rate or something. Can you explain that? I didn't fully understand it. I'm so bad with numbers. It's unreal.
It's complicated stuff. I've been covering this for 5 years, and I've just now, like, very recently come to a place where I can kind of explain it. So I'm going to try my best. So I will say that I haven't seen this reported in Venezuelan media. So I don't know. I'm not saying that it's not true. So this is a report that came up on AFP, right? It was citing a government official saying that they had. Sorry, I'm just reading the headline. Yeah, so I'd rather not comment on this too much because I just don't know all the facts. I do see a headline here on a Venezuelan news outlet that is mentioning something like it. I would have to read it. But basically, what the headline that you linked said was that a government official had said that they would scrap the official exchange rate and that the black market exchange rate would become the official exchange rate. So, like, what does that mean? When you go to the bank, so I live in Canada. When I go to the bank in Canada and I say I want to buy some US dollars, they'll pull up an official exchange rate, right? And they'll say, okay, this is what a US dollar costs today, right? And I'll just buy it at that rate. For many years in Venezuela, that system hasn't worked that way. There's been an official rate that is artificially very, very low. So you can buy US dollars for like almost nothing. And the black market rate has been very, very high. So what you could do is, if you were like really well connected with people in government, because you have to get the official dollars from the government, is you would be able to just buy US dollars for nothing, really, for like cents. And then you would turn around and you could sell them in the black market for huge profits. So that scam is basically a way to print US dollars for basically free. And people were doing that for many years. That's one of the reasons why the country's in this really bad shape, because all of the money was going into private pockets of people basically scamming money out of the government. And it also, that system, that two-tiered system, having the official rate and the black market rate at the same time, what that did was it also affected the scarcity crisis. So, I could make up like a shell company and I could say, yeah, I need $1 million to like import food and medicine through my company. I would buy $1 million for really, really cheap from the government. I wouldn't import anything, and I would instead, turn around and sell that money and make a profit, right? So if they are, and again, I want to double check this, but if the government is erasing the two tiered system and just going with what the black market says, it would do two things. It would make the Bolivar Soberano, which is the currency, so it would make it worth even less, which isn't good, and it would also eliminate a really important mechanism of corruption. But I have to double check. I'm thinking that it might be like, I want to know like which government official said this. I want to know if it was like a Guaido government official or a Maduro government official, because that sounds like something a Guaido government official would say. And if a Guaido government official said that, then it doesn't carry much water right now because they're not in a position to do it. So this is just another example of like how fluid the situation is. I'm trying to keep up with this like minute to minute, and there's stuff happening that I just don't know. There's so many things going on at once.
Yeah. What was that thing that happened the other day? It became like this internet meme. I think Guaido went to meet someone. He was hooded up. I think the Maduro government said that it was proof that he was some kind of US asset or something. I didn't fully understand it. Can you explain it if you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, is this the thing about the hoodie?
Yeah, the Guaido challenge.
Yeah, right, the Guaido challenge. Yeah, so, all right. So this is kind of a funny story. So historically, during the Maduro years, one of the tricks that the government has pulled is that they will tell people that opposition leaders are secretly meeting with them. And the reason they do this is because people hate the government and they don't want people to secretly meet with the government, right? Like they feel like they're selling out, right? So they've always done this. They've done it since Maduro. It's possible they did it under Chavez as well. I don't remember. but they've always done it under Maduro. They've said, oh, you guys like so-and-so so much, you think he's your leader. Well, like, did you know that he like went to Maduro's house yesterday and whatever, right? It's supposed to discredit them.
They're playing both sides.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it sows discontent and stuff, and people, they start talking about that, and they're distracted. So the other day, the Minister of Communication, he goes on TV and he does that. He plays that same card that they've always played. He showed this like really grainy video, supposedly from some hotel in Caracas, and it shows like a couple of government guys like walking into this hotel room, and then like the video skips a while, and then there's like this guy whose face is like completely hidden underneath a hoodie, and I think he's wearing a baseball cap. Like it could be anybody, it could be me, it could be you. And then the guy, he makes like such a huge deal out of it. If you watch a clip, he's like, all right, now pause the video, now rewind. And then like they draw like this red circle around this.
Enhance.
Yeah, he's like, enhance, And then it's like, this is Juan Guaidó, and he said he wasn't here, but he was. Meanwhile, it could be literally anybody. There's no way. It's a human male, basically, in the video. So then what was really funny was that people reacted to it, obviously, in like total mockery of it, because it was just such an absurd attempt to do the same thing that they've always done. So there was this trending hashtag after called Guaidó Challenge, and it was just like people like putting hoodies in on their dogs, or like, and they're being like, no, like that wasn't Guaidó, like that was my dog, and it's like a picture of the dog in a hoodie, and it was trending for a while. I think people, I mean, even by the government standards, it was like that was a really poor attempt at it. It was good that it was turned into like a brief moment of like laughter in what is otherwise a pretty miserable situation. That was like Guaidó Challenge.
And what about Chavez supporters? I saw some footage where I think there was an anti-Maduro protest in a Chavez stronghold. Now, I could be wrong on that. It's been a couple of days since I saw it. But I think that's what I saw. What are Chavez supporters? I know obviously Chavez is not the same as Maduro. What's going on?
Yeah, so the earlier protests that we saw last week, so these are the ones on the 21st and the 22nd, those caught people by surprise, not only because they took place before the scheduled protests of the 23rd, but also because they took place in areas, I'm speaking specifically of Caracas, in really poor areas that have been historically bastions of the PSUV. There were, Chavez strongholds. So this is like the 23 de Enero, Katia, in the Cotiza area where we had the mutiny, the National Guard mutiny. So those caught a lot of people by surprise because it was evidence that even the people who were supporting Chavez and Maduro, even up till recently, were out protesting. So this is something that we wouldn't have seen many years ago. If you go back to like the protests of 2007, these were areas that wouldn't have gone out to protest, but they were out on the streets this week. And I think that's evidence of something that, should be clear. Like, if there's scarcity in the country and if there's, lack of food, lack of medicine, poor electrical service, poor water service, and that is all true, those things affect the poor the most. If you've got lots of money, if you're really rich, you can afford to go buy food, you can afford to have it imported, you can afford to have like private collection of garbage. But if you're the poorest of the poor, you don't, and you suffer the most. So I think what we're seeing in the protests in those areas is an inevitable reaction to the failed government of Maduro. I'll also say that it's really important to consider the difference between Chavismo and Madurismo. There's a bit of a debate in Venezuela about if there is such a thing as Madurismo. Like, has Maduro created a political legacy that is different from Chavez? Like, is he a different kind of PSUV leader, right? And so it's going to be really important moving forward to answer that question and to say, when people think about socialism in Venezuela, do they think about Chavez or do they think about Maduro? If they think about Chavez, then the project might have another chance in the future. People might say, look, Maduro was a mistake. Clearly, he didn't know what he was doing. He was a dictator. Let's go back, let's get closer to what Chavez was trying to do. If they can't do that, if they equate Chavez's rule with Maduro's rule, I think Chavismo, will be dead in Venezuela.
Yeah, it's interesting. It also ties in. I see a lot of Americans. They're always like, this is what happens when your country is on socialism. And it's like, man, that country hasn't been a socialist country for a very long time, right? If you look at the theory and the concepts, Maduro is a complete crook.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that upsets me a lot about headlines from the U.S. I mean, Fox News obviously always does this, but I think NBC did it as well. Also, like they'll say things like, oh, this is like the third day of protest of socialist Maduro's whatever, right? Like they'll mention the word socialism, and it's like, well, like that's not really, you're not really clarifying the picture. That's not an accurate description of why the country is suffering in this way. Like you could use, instead of socialism, you could use like more, you could use a word like kleptocracy, authoritarianism, dictatorship, right? There's other words that you can use that would more accurately describe, oh, that's why the country's so messed up. It's because of the kleptocracy or a dictatorship, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not arguing for any political theory. I'm not even arguing for socialism, but it just seems so dumb. It's like the equivalent of saying, oh, well, democracy is shit because of North Korea, because it's called the Democratic Republic. You know what I mean? It's just stupid.
Yeah, it's the same thing about looking at a political event in another country through your own political lens, right? Like the word socialism is a big one in the United States right now because of, the situation there. And so people are trying to score really cheap political points, by throwing it around. So, I said this to somebody the other day, like the situation in Venezuela is really complicated. It's been unfolding for at least 20 years. And you can't just like read a couple articles and think that you're up on it. It's a really, really complicated situation. You can't just define it with a couple buzzwords or think that you have a grasp of it based on what you saw, on NBC or on Fox News. It's a really big mess, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, what do you think is the best way for people to, I guess, stay nuanced when reading up on this, rapid fire situation right now in Venezuela?
Well, I think, that's a hard question. There's so much misinformation out there just because, there's a lot of information and some of it will always be misinformation. I think you have to do two things. You have to, on the first hand, you have to be aware of your own political baggage. So when you're approaching the situation in Venezuela and you want to learn what's going on, you have to ask yourself, what are the political and personal preconceptions that I'm bringing to this? Like, how do I understand the world before I wade into this conversation? And how might that affect how I read the situation in the country? So that's the first thing I would suggest. And the other one is to say, all right, like, let me not rely on what like Telesur or like propaganda outlets will say, or like, let me try to sort of view this through the eyes of an average Venezuelan person. Like when I look at a video and I see like 1,000 people protesting, like why are they there? What is it that brought them to the streets that day, right? So try to understand it from their point of view. And I realize this is going to be difficult for a lot of people who don't speak Spanish, right? But don't fall into the temptation that you've got it all figured out, that you're looking at this from your house in whatever, Brooklyn or London, and that you've figured it all out, and that
usually Brooklyn.
It's usually Brooklyn, yeah. But try not to do that. Try not to do that, right? Like ask yourself, what is my political baggage? How do I understand the world? How is this tainting or distorting what I understand the situation to be? And whenever possible, try to listen to the people of the country who are out there protesting. Like, why are they out there? If you do those two things, I think you won't fall so easily into those traps of like, oh, they're fascists, or it's a U.S. coup, or Maduro's actually a good guy.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly for me, like reading your work on the In Venezuela blog has been excellent. Can you tell us, where can people get to that, and how can they keep in touch with you? Because I think what you're doing is probably the most detailed in the English language on this whole situation that I've seen, and completely.
Oh, thanks, man. That means a lot. I've had this page for a couple of years now. It's sort of now becoming a little bit more popular, and it's because of the protests. I'm happy to see that people are learning from it and that they're reading it really. So the page is in-venezuela.com. If you find me on Twitter, I'm at Gian Fiorella, GIANFIORELLA. You'll see a link to my Twitter account for my page, and then you can see a link to the website there. So what I do is every day I comb through the news and I translate them into English, and I try to put them in context as well. So I try to explain like, okay, like what does it mean for this guy to say this, or what does it mean for a protest to take place here? there's a couple of Twitter people who are always sort of following the situation as well. So if you find me on Twitter, I try to tweet out the sort of the best information that I can find.
Okay. And you promise you're not a US plant?
No, man. I keep telling people, like, if I haven't seen a single dime. Like, if the CIA really, is like, I wish they would send me checks, but I'm not getting paid for this.
Yeah. All right, mate. Thanks very much. That was amazing. Great work you're doing, man. And thanks very much for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Cheers, man. See you in a bit. That was Giancarlo Fiorella talking about the possible imminent war, revolution, or coup in Venezuela. Who knows what's going to happen? It's not looking very good. And like we said in the episode, things have been moving rapidly. And since we recorded it on Monday, for example, the US Ambassador of Security Affairs, John Bolton, he has said some mad stuff, basically kind of sounding like he just wants to go in to Venezuela because, it will work well for business. He had this insane thing where he had a little notepad written at some press conference, and on it said send 5,000 troops to Colombia. Certainly there have been Colombian troops sent to the border of Venezuela now. Also, Maduro has started up a new, what he calls a People's Protection Force, I believe. So basically just giving civilians guns in the barrios and here, there and everywhere, and saying that they have to help the military in case of war. So I think it's looking really bad right now. Who knows what's going to happen. But yeah, do check out Giancarlo's work. His blog, In Venezuela blog, is very good. He's been covering this for a very long time. I've been following his work for ages. There are a lot of spooky fuckers on the internet, to be honest, like real kind of hardcore communists or, Assad apologists, kind of saying that he's this, I don't know, they're saying he's some kind of like asset for the US government or something, and he came out of nowhere, absolute dog shit, let me tell you. I'll be the first to call him out if he was. His work has been going around for a very long time. He's been doing this for no fucking money. I trust his work completely. He's a really good guy. Anyway, this week's episode, as usual, was sponsored by thedefensepost.com, defense with an S. Check them out for all your latest up-to-date coverage on war and conflict across the world. The episode is also sponsored by Atlas News on Instagram. That's instagram.com/atlas.news. Check them out. It's a pretty cool way of getting your news via Instagram, I guess. Most of it is conflict related. In fact, I think all of it on there is conflict related, so have a look at them. And if you like what we're doing at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. I've said this 100 times, we will not be having corporate vampirism in the podcast, so the only way to keep it going is via the Patreon independent support. That is patreon.com/popularfront. Even if you think, you know what, I'll just throw in $1 a month just to help out. It does help out, trust me. Like I said 100 times, we've had nearly 200,000 unique downloads on the podcast. So, if even a quarter of those people said, you know what, I'll throw in $1 a month, we'd be flying, we'd be doing the docs and everything. Things would be good. Speaking of docs, we've got another one coming up soon. So go to youtube.com/popularfront. Subscribe there, hit the bell, all of that. Stay notified because there will be a new documentary coming soon. It's to do with, it will be in Ukraine, put it that way. I'll say that much. To keep up to date with Popular Front on Twitter, follow me. That's twitter.com/Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. Or follow the Popular Front account. That's at Popular Front CO. Same as the website, popularfront.co. All the episodes in order are on there. Ways to donate, Bitcoin, everything, that's on there. Thank you very much to the following people. Without your help, this wouldn't be possible. They are Adam Bergsnyder, Axel Iverson, Chad Walker, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Darby, Diana Gorvanek, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Jack Mayhoff, Jacob Janowski, James from the Discord, Sebastian from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Joshua Yabbott, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Margaret Bowling, Michael Euler, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from the What Bitcoin Did podcast. He's been a real massive help to Popular Front. Thank you very much. Rosha Alakidi, same massive help, as is everyone here. Ryan Sandercock, Scartoon, Scott Jonesy, Sean Fowler, Surishe Hawazi, Teddy, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, and Zachary Hinch. Thank you very much. Honestly, if all you lot vanished, the Popular Front would vanish, so thanks very much. Music in this episode, The intro is by Home, and the outro is by Son of Old. He's my mate, and actually this beat he made for my birthday. I thought that was pretty cool. It was my birthday last week, so yeah, cheers, mate. Follow his work at soundcloud.com/son-of-old, SUNOFOLD, Son of Old.